called The Elements of Eloquence by Mark Forsyth. Forsyth? I'm not sure, it's British. Anyway, this book is amazing. It explains the flowers of rhetoric, which a lot of people have forgotten because it wasn't really taught in schools. And this is going to be a series. This is the first part in a series where I'm going to read bits of this book because this is really cool. Let's start first with the preface, shall we? It's called On Cooking Blindfolded. Shakespeare was not a genius. He was, without the distant shadow of a doubt, the most wonderful writer who ever breathed. But not a genius. No angels handed him his lines, no fairies proofread for him. Instead, he learned techniques. He learned tricks. And he learned them well. Genius, as we tend to talk about it today, is some sort of mysterious and combustible substance that burns brightly and burns out. It's the strange gift of poets and pop stars that allows them to produce one wonderful work in their early 20s and then nothing. It is mysterious, it is there, it is gone. This is, if you think about it, a rather odd idea. Nobody would talk about a doctor or an accountant or a taxi driver who burnt out too fast, too brilliant to live long. Pretty much everyone in every profession outside of professional athletics gets better as they go along, for the rather obvious reason that they learn and they practice. Why should writers be any different? Shakespeare wasn't different. Shakespeare got better and better and better, which was easy because he started badly, like most people starting a new job. Nobody is quite sure which is Shakespeare's first play, but the contenders are Love's Labour's Lost, Titus Andronicus, and Henry VI, Part 1. Do not, dear reader, worry if you have not read these plays. Almost nobody has, because, to be utterly frank, they weren't very good. To be precise about it, there isn't a single memorable line in any of them. Now, for Shakespeare, that may seem rather astonishing. He was, after all, the master of the memorable line, but the first line of Shakespeare that almost anybody knows is in Henry VI, Part 2, when one revolting peasant, not revolting as in, like, how revolting, but like, revolting! Anyway, one revolting peasant says to another, "The first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers." In Part 3, there's a couple more. I can smile and murder while I smile, and each successive play has more and more and more great lines until you work up through Much Ado and Julius Caesar, the 1590s, to Hamlet and King Lear, the 1600s. Shakespeare got better because he learned. Now, some people will tell you that great writing cannot be learned. Such people should be hit repeatedly on the nose until they promise not to talk nonsense anymore. Shakespeare was taught how to write. He was taught it at school. Composition, in Latin, was the main part of an Elizabethan education. And importantly, you had to learn the figures of rhetoric. Professionally, Shakespeare wrote in English, and for that he learned and used the figures of rhetoric in English. This was easy, as Elizabethan London was crazy for rhetorical figures. A chap called George Puttenham, I'm guessing that's how you pronounce it because it's British, had a bestseller in 1589 with his book on them. That's about the year Shakespeare's first play. And that was just following on from Henry Peacham's The Garden of Eloquence, which had come out like a decade earlier. Book after book was published all about the figures of rhetoric, so I should probably explain what the figures of rhetoric are. Rhetoric is a big subject. It consists of the whole art of persuasion, the lot. It includes logic, or the sloppy kind of logic that most people understand, called enthymemes, E-N-T-H-Y-M-E-M-E-S. It includes speaking loudly and clearly, and it includes working out what topics to talk about. Anything to do with persuasion is rhetoric, right down to the argumentum ad baculum, which means threatening somebody with a stick until they agree with you. One minuscule part of this massive subject is the figures of rhetoric, which are the techniques for making a single phrase striking and memorable just by altering the wording. Not by saying something different, but by saying something in a different way. There are formulas for producing great lines. These formulas were taught These formulas were thought up by the ancient Greeks and then added to by the Romans. As Shakespeare set to work, England was busy having the Renaissance. Everybody else had the Renaissance a century or so before. We were running a bit behind. So the classical works on rhetoric were dug out, translated, and adapted for use in English. But it wasn't the enthymemes or the topics or even the baculums that the English liked. We loved the figures, the flowers of rhetoric as they were called, hence the Garden of Eloquence. Because as a nation, we were at the time rather obsessed with poetry. So Shakespeare learnt and got better and better, and his lines became more and more striking and more memorable. But most of his great and famous lines are simply examples of the ancient formulas. I can smile and murder when I smile was not handed to Shakespeare by God. It's just an example of a diacope, or diacope, D-I-A-C-O-P-E. So why, you may be asking, were you not taught the figures of rhetoric at school? If they can make a chap write as well as Shakespeare, shouldn't we be learning them instead of home economics and woodwork? Well, I mean, we aren't technically learning those anymore. We should be, but we aren't. Although some schools, especially in the US, have replaced woodworking with like welding or metal shop or like even mechanic, like with cars, which is kind of cool. Anyway, shouldn't we be learning them instead of home economics and woodwork? There are 3 answers to that. First, we need woodworkers. Or in this case, metal workers. Anyway, I digress. Second, people have always been suspicious of rhetoric in general and the figures in particular. If somebody learns how to phrase things beautifully, they might be able to persuade you of something that isn't true. That sounds familiar. Stern people dislike rhetoric. And unfortunately, it's usually stern people who are in charge. Solemn fools who believe in truth is more important than beauty. Although, let's be real, truth is kind of a loose term to use there. Third, the Romantic movement came along at the end of the 18th century. The Romantics liked to believe that you could learn everything worth learning by gazing at a babbling mountain brook or running barefoot through the fields or contemplating a Grecian urn. They wanted to be natural, and the figures of rhetoric are not natural. They are formulas that you can learn from a book, like this one. So, what with the dislike of beauty in books, the figures of rhetoric were largely forgotten. But that doesn't mean that they ceased to be used. You see, when the ancient Greeks were going around collecting their formulas, they weren't plucking them out of thin air or growing them in a test tube. All that the Greeks were doing was noting down the best and most memorable phrases they heard and working out what the structures were, in much the same way that when you or I eat a particularly delicious meal, we might ask for the recipe. The figures are, to some extent, alive and well. We still use them. It's just that we use them haphazardly. What Shakespeare had beaten into him at school, we might occasionally use by accident without realizing it. We just happen to say something beautiful and don't know how we did it. We are like blindfolded cooks, throwing anything into the pot and occasionally, just occasionally, producing a delicious meal. Shakespeare had a big recipe book and his eyes wide open. The figures are alive and thriving. The one line from that song or film that you remember and don't know why you remember is almost certainly down to one of the figures, one of the flowers of rhetoric growing wild. They account for the songs you sing and the poems you love, although that is hidden from you at school. English teaching at school is unfortunately obsessed with what a poet thought, as though that were of any interest to anyone. Rather than being taught about how a poem is phrased, school children are asked to write essays about what William Blake thought about the tiger, despite the fact that William Blake was a nutjob whose opinions in a civilized society would be of no interest to anybody apart from his parole officer. Okay, yeah, this is kind of true as someone an English major. Yeah, although I can actually answer why that is, it's because it's literally critical thinking. If you can think, why did this author write this? What mindset were they in when they wrote this? You can think, oh, okay, so this person is actually not great. They had a political agenda. They were kind of a jerk. Or like H.P. Lovecraft was literally afraid of everything. And especially people who were not of pure Norwegian descent. That's why like all of his heroes he goes out of his way to say that they were of pure Norwegian descent. Freaking wild. He has a short story about like the horrors of the AC unit and how it will like bring the dead back to life or keep the dead like preserved for longer. Like literally the whole short story is about this person's upstairs neighbor or whatever who is dead, but the AC unit is keeping him moving around. He was afraid of everything. Anyway, a poet is not somebody who has great thoughts. That is the menial duty of the philosopher. A poet is somebody who expresses his thoughts, however commonplace they may be, exquisitely. That is the one and only difference between the poet and everybody else. So my aim in this book is to explain the figures of rhetoric, devoting one chapter to each. There are a couple of caveats that I should make clear before we begin. First of all, the study of rhetoric did not entirely disappear with the Romantics. There are still scholarly articles written. Unfortunately, almost all of these get tied in knots at trying to define their terms. Rhetorical terminology, like anything kicked around for a couple of millennia, is a mess. So, an article on solipsis, which we'll figure out what that is later, will start by defining the term, attacking other scholars for defining it differently, appealing to the authority of Quintilian or Susenbrotus, and then conclude without actually having said anything about solipsis or what it is. I've written more on the subject in the epilogue, but as I have no particular interest in such lexical squabbles, I have simply adopted the rule of Humpty Dumpty. When I use a rhetorical term, it means just what I choose it to mean. Neither more nor less. Second, some of you may think that I am trying to attack Shakespeare, or whichever poet I'm quoting. You may consider this a cruel work of debunking, like the spoilsports who uncurtained The Wizard of Oz. Shakespeare is a god, and it is sacrilege to unseal his starry pointing pyramid. Little could be further from the truth. It doesn't insult the Wright brothers to explain the principles of aerodynamics, nor Neil Armstrong the spacesuit. Shakespeare was a craftsman, and if you told him how people studied his attitudes to feminism more than his rhetorical figures, he would chuckle. Shakespeare did not consider himself sacred. He would often just steal content from other people. However, whatever he stole, he improved, and he improved it using the formulas, flowers, and figures of rhetoric. That is the preface. I will continue, whether anyone likes it or not, because honestly, I love this book so far. I've only gotten about halfway through, but honestly, it is great. Also, I feel like it's a little late, but I feel like I should read the back of this book for you. In an age unhealthily obsessed with substance, this is a book on the importance of pure style. From classic poetry to pop lyrics, and from the King James Bible to advertising slogans, Mark Forsyth explains the secrets that make a phrase such as "tiger, tiger, burning bright," or "to be or not to be" memorable. In his inimitably entertaining and witty style, he takes apart famous lines and shows how you too can write like Shakespeare or Oscar Wilde. Whether you're aiming for literary immortality or just an unforgettable one-liner, the Elements of Eloquence proves that you don't need to have everything to say, or anything to say. You simply need to say it well. And I feel like that's yeah. Anyway, if you would like to read the next chapter, which is Chapter 1, Alliteration, I really think you should follow along because this is hilarious. See you next time.